Welcome back to Kaleidoscope with Daisy Cousens. I am here with the delightful Blaire White. Now, Blaire, you mentioned earlier in this interview that a lot of your fans on YouTube tend to skew younger with Generation Z and teenagers. As you mentioned, that is actually unusual for right-wing commentators. I mean, my demographic on YouTube tend to be very much millennials, sort of between 25 and 45. That's the sort of plurality. Other conservatives, it skews even older. So I have to ask you, there are a lot of parents out there, for instance, of teenagers and young people who must be totally nonplussed by what's going on. I mean, it's such a trend among Generation Z to identify with sort of one of 67 different genders. Back when I was in high school, they would have just been emo or goth or said they were bisexual but never do anything about it. But now it's this gender movement. And it is tough on parents to manage that. So how do you think that parents can best communicate with their teenagers about all these issues of gender?
Yeah, I empathize a lot with parents because it's a weird kind of world right now, right? And even aside from the trans stuff, it's like we're coming out of the pandemic and part of it was like home learning and part of it wasn't. And, we're seeing society sort of recalibrate in a lot of ways. And I don't want to get off on a tangent, but with the trans
Tangents
stuff,
are
I think
fine.
it's really important. I think it's really important for people to understand that gender ideology and the way that they're teaching gender in school right now is not some science. It's not a fact. It's literally a belief system. And it's a belief system that is inappropriate to even be taught in schools.
Mm.
It's not the same as learning about any other group either, because you know you don't have to learn an ideology to understand to respect people of different races. You don't have to learn a different ideology even to understand or respect gay people. And it's not about raising them to not be hateful or to raising them to be tolerant. That's the guise it's all under. So they insert all these you know non-factual, completely strange things into the curriculum and under the guise of, well, we're teaching them to be, upstanding citizens who are tolerant of trans people. It's not about that. It's about indoctrination. It's about, you know, on a more insidious level, separating children from their parents, creating a
Mm.
barrier. Uh, and my advice to parents, though, because I don't want to just talk about why it's all bad, I want to give, a solution here is
Mm.
to have your own conversations before they even start teaching it in school. And I know it's quite young, but there are age appropriate ways to talk about everything. Even if the conversation you're having is, there's going to be a lot of things said about this particular topic, and just understand that we're in a weird time in the world. And so people are kind of off their rocker with the way they're talking about things. And I mean, it's really like that,
Mm.
and I actually, because I've been doing it so long, I have, fans that have reached out and said they become parents in that time. I mean, in the
Oh,
time that you
wow.
could have become a fan of me from year one to year now, you have potentially, a 7, 8 year old.
Mm.
And a lot of them are raising their kids just and letting them know, like, there are other thoughts out there, right? And it's not just what they're teaching you in school.
Mm.
And I think that that's ultimately a great way to raise a kid in general, like to not teach a kid to just be subservient to, necessarily just teachers, and have a blind belief and respect and authority, so much so that they build your worldview for you. Have your own conversations with your kids. Don't just leave it up to the state.
Absolutely. Getting there preemptively, I think, is excellent advice to parents nowadays. Because there's so much ideology taught in school, not just gender ideology, but all sorts of critical race theory they try to slip in there. So great advice, Blaire.
Yeah.
Parents, get in there preemptively. Now, Blaire, I'm going to jump sideways a little bit, but it is an election year in the USA. It's a big one. You've got Trump v. Biden 2.0. Lots going on. I just want to pick your brain a little bit. Now, I know this might be a hard question for anyone to answer at this point in time, and maybe it's a bit oversimplified, but in your opinion, do you think we'll have 4 more years of Joe Biden, or do you think that Donald Trump might manage to do it this time?
I think that if the election is, handled with care, handled fairly, if things are pushed through fairly, if every vote is counted correctly,
Mm.
that we will have 4 more years of Trump. I think that right now we're in the midst of a culture shift, at least here in the US. I can't speak for abroad, but right here, people are really, waking up, and they're not waking up to suddenly loving Trump, but they're waking up to the fact that Trump, at the very least, stood against a lot of lies, a lot of deception. And when you figure out that you've been lied to, you don't have to like the guy who's telling the truth to make the choice to say, you know what, I'd rather the person that's telling me the truth.
Mm.
And I actually think it's a really beautiful thing that's happening. I just hope that the election actually reflects that, because it's hard to say, right?
Mm.
And it's even on a bigger level, it's hard to say if it's ever truly reflected that, how am I supposed to know if elections have always run fairly or not? I know that I've seen certain things that make me believe that's potentially not true. I also know that every side always complains when they lose that it wasn't fair. So I might have fallen into that in 2020. But at the end of the day, I think that if it's just going by, the culture shift happening, we'll have 4 more years of Trump, and we'll be better for it. You
Mm.
also have to factor in the fact that people are seeing all this chaos in the Middle East. People are scared.
Mm.
It's hard not to be scared. And and we live so far away from it, and yet there's so much to be fearful about with our own involvement. And people are remembering that whole peace in the Middle East thing. People are remembering that Trump was the person who got us to coast through at least a few years where we weren't worrying about a war.
Mm.
So I think that that is also a really big thing in people's minds right now. It's like, okay, which choice is the least likely to get us involved in a war? And that's just so clearly Trump. I mean, there's really no argument to the contrary of that. And you
Yeah.
don't have to like anything else he's ever said or done. But, in a time of chaos like this, I think that's everyone's number one.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. I mean, there are people who get turned off by Trump's personality. I don't. I think he's hilarious. I love watching his
Me
rallies.
too.
Yeah, I know you do. Like, yeah, he's so much fun. But a lot of people, they get turned off by the kind of the brashness. But I agree with Blaire. Americans, if you vote with anything in your mind, peace in the Middle East is a good one. Trump has an excellent track record on that. The Democrats most certainly do not. So Blaire, you raise a really excellent point. And Blaire, you have raised so many excellent points during this interview. It has been so much fun. Before we go, you have a wonderful online empire. You're on the socials. You've got multiple YouTube channels. You've done amazing interviews with people like Joe Rogan and Piers Morgan. Tell us, where can people find you online? Where can they watch all your wonderful content?
Definitely just search up Blaire White. As far as I know, I'm the only person with that name on socials. So just look up my name. It's a rabbit hole, but have fun with whatever comes up. And yeah, there's a lot you can expect this year from me. I have one of the biggest projects I was ever involved in coming out in about 3 weeks.
Ooh, it's
I
exciting.
also Yeah, and I also am going to be announcing a tour really soon, a US tour where I'm going and doing sort of like a stand-up motivational speech hybrid with, a Q&A and meeting all my fans. So tour, big projects coming, and I just want to get everything that I want to do this year out before the election so that I can just coast, and whatever chaos happens, I can just hang out for the end of the year.
Well, that all sounds incredibly exciting. And look, Blaire, if I could just have a final thought. We've talked so much about all these crazy elements of the trans movement that might be tarring the reputation of trans people. In 30, 40 seconds or less, is there anything that you would like to say to, say, apolitical people out there who might be looking at these crazy elements and thinking, well, that's what all trans people are like? What would you say to those people?
I would say that's really not true of any other group that you could apply it to.
Mm.
So it must not be true for that group. I think that the difference between trans people and a lot of other groups where you maybe see a more visible contradiction to the craziness, more sane voices, is that those populations are A, a lot bigger. B, there's not an incentive to not be public figures, right? So, like, a lot of people's incentive when they transition is to not even talk about it, to just live their lives in peace and not be public figures. I'm just an
Mm.
outlier who, you know, is very public. But yeah, ideology versus individual, they're always different.
Blaire White, you are truly magical. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us all, and I do hope that we can chat to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.